The Trump administration is clearly already in a political trap, from which it remains to be seen how it will manage to escape. The peace strategy for Ukraine has collided head-on with Vladimir Putin, who is in no hurry to end the war, and with Volodymyr Zelensky, who is adamant about Ukraine's position. And that is what may explain some of the latest twists we are seeing in the discourse of this US president. Without going any further, look at what Trump is starting to say.
If Russia and I are unable to make a deal on stopping the bloodshed in Ukraine, and if I think it was Russia's fault, which it might not be, but if I think it was Russia's fault, I'm going to put secondary tariffs on all oil coming out of Russia.
These statements are important because they are the first time that Trump has spoken so clearly in an interview. It's the first time he has at least given a clear warning to the Russian president. Very mild, yes, but a warning nonetheless. And this comes after Trump himself agreed with Putin just a few days ago to begin lifting some of the sanctions against Russia.
We're talking, for example, about lifting sanctions on certain Russian banks so that their banking system can reconnect with the rest of the world. Of course, that was several days ago. Now, instead, they're threatening Putin with secondary sanctions in prime time. The Trump administration is anything but predictable.
But now, as you can see, he's threatening Putin with secondary tariffs on prime time. Now, what are these secondary tariffs? Well, Trump himself has explained them. Check it out.
That would be that if you buy oil from Russia, you can't do business in the United States. There will be a 25% tariff on all oil, a 25 to 50-point tariff on all oil.
This would affect countries like China or India, so really? Hard to believe, especially after everything we've been seeing in recent weeks, where the concessions to Putin have followed one after the other, to the point that Trump is already basically a Santa Claus for Vladimir Putin. And yet, now the US president claims to be very angry with the Russian dictator. Perhaps someone has finally explained to him that Moscow is bullying him, that it's making him dizzy, to get a better position in the war, for the end of which Russia has no intention of making any concessions.
Trump says he's very angry and pissed off at Putin during an NBC News interview.
Well, it seems that the 5D chess thing that some people are talking about is not working out as planned. VisualPolitik community, this is the first time Trump has clearly threatened Putin since he came to the White House, so it's clearly significant. But watch out, because this is not the only back and forth regarding Ukraine that Trump has had in recent days. The truth? His administration is starting to be on a real rollercoaster. For example, on Thursday, March 27th, the president ordered the suspension of funding for a Yale University research project to document and trace nearly 20,000 Ukrainian children abducted by Russian forces. Behind the elimination of those funds was a decision by DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, led by Elon Musk. Nevertheless, in just a few hours, and after controversy broke out, Trump reversed the decision to cut funding to this project.
Trump reverses termination of program tracking mass child abductions in Ukraine. The rare about-face follows a Washington Post report on the program's fate and concerns from U.S. lawmakers and Christian evangelicals about Russia's alleged war crimes.
I'm not gonna lie, it's been very complicated to follow all the events related to Trump and Ukraine. The numerous changes of direction, the constant concessions to Russia, the back and forth with Zelensky, the contradictory statements from various members of Trump's team. All this gives us the feeling that, in this administration right now, they are walking around like headless chickens. Of course, the idea that Trump was going to end the war in 24 hours, because Putin respects him, is far behind us. Yes, we know that it was just a manner of talking, very much in the style of what election campaigns are becoming, where lying does not matter. But the point is that it's possible that this matter will drag on so much longer than the president had imagined. Remember that all this is happening in a context of ceasefire negotiations. These negotiations included a full 30-day ceasefire, which Zelensky accepted unconditionally, but which Russia rejected with a resounding no. In return, Moscow suggested a partial ceasefire, which not surprisingly favored its interests, and which it has not even fully complied with. First, there was the partial ceasefire on energy infrastructure that the Kremlin violated within hours. And last week, with a ceasefire in the Black Sea that Putin now says he doesn't intend to honor if the United States does not lift those financial sanctions we recently told you about here on VisualPolitik. In other words, nothing is working. So far, these negotiations are proving to be total chaos for Trump and a pain for Zelensky, much to the delight of the Kremlin. Now wait a minute, with everything we've told you so far, it's possible that many of you think that Trump is starting to take a better look at Ukraine, that he will do more to favor Kyiv, if for no other reason than to ultimately put pressure on Moscow. But what if I told you that the opposite is possible? Yes, we aren't exaggerating. VisualPolitik community. A few days ago, the plan that the Trump administration has regarding the famous minerals deal with Ukraine was unveiled. It's an agreement that was never signed after the attempted humiliation of Zelensky at the White House on February 28th, and which is now coming to the fore again. The problem? The terms are totally different. And yes, let me say it clearly, they are also totally unacceptable. We're talking about an extensive document that we've studied in detail, and to tell you the truth, what I can say, this proposal from the White House has left us speechless. VisualPolitik community, as we go on, we're going to tell you all the key facts about the US proposal on Ukrainian minerals, oil, and gas. That is, the new famous mineral deal. Although it has little in the way of minerals, because it includes many more things. So stay tuned, because what you're about to see is something you might never have imagined.
Ukraine, US colony.
Pay close attention to these statements.
It is an expropriation document. There are no guarantees, no defense clauses. The US puts up nothing. The Americans can walk away, the Ukrainians can't. I've never seen anything like it before.
The opinion you have just heard is not at all an exaggeration. What's more, based on the document now presented by the White House, anyone would come to the same conclusion. The new US proposal for the mineral agreement would, in practice, amount to an expropriation of the country's wealth. It would practically turn Ukraine into an extractive colony in the service of Washington in the style of the 19th century. And yes, many of you may think this is an exaggeration. That's why we're going to give you all the details so that you can draw your own conclusions. The first thing you need to keep in mind is that the purpose of the famous mineral agreement is the creation of a US-Ukraine reconstruction investment fund. In the first proposal, Ukraine and the United States maintain a certain balance in the fund's returns, and it only applied to new investments. In other words, everything that Ukraine already exploits was left out, and there was certainly very little breakdown. In fact, as we already told you, the first agreement was more of a goodwill political compromise, a face-to-the-gallery deal than something with real implications. But now, this has changed radically. So let's start right from the very beginning. Control of Ukraine's natural resources. The agreement suggests that the United States will control all Ukrainian infrastructure linked to natural resources. And remember, we aren't only talking about mines, but also gas pipelines, oil pipelines, processing facilities, liquefaction and regasification of natural gas, and even more. The proposal will also give Washington control of roads, railroads, ports, terminals, refineries, and more. Ukraine will be required to contribute a significant portion of its exploitation rights and royalties on all these assets, present and future assets. It's totally bizarre. In practice, the entire Ukrainian energy sector would be subordinated to decisions made in Washington. Now, why do we say that the United States would have control? How would they exercise it on the basis of this proposal? Well, in several ways.
For starters, the White House proposal now establishes a 5-member Reconstruction Fund Board of Directors. Of those 5, 3 would be chosen by the United States, so Washington would have a majority to decide on any issue. To give you an idea of how far this proposal goes, the US would keep all the Ukrainian resource money until Ukraine has paid off at least $100 billion of what they call war debt, although this figure is yet to be determined and could be higher.
And to make matters worse, this figure will be surcharged with a 4% interest rate each year. Now, is this too much or too little? Well, it seems that it will be far from the $350 billion that Trump demanded at the beginning, so it is more than half of Ukraine's GDP. So naturally, it's an unaffordable amount for Kyiv. It would take them a very, very long time to generate these resources until they pay back the US debt, plus interest, which would obviously mean losing a lot of economic resources for a very, very long time. Even the resources they already have. But that's not even all. The White House wants its share in the fund to have more rights than the Ukrainian share. In other words, it wants its share to generate special powers. Now, how the heck can this even be? Well, the fund would have 3 types of shares. The A shares, which are those of the United States, the B shares, which would be those of Ukraine, and the C shares, which would be those of other investors who might want to join in the future. At this rate, who knows? In Washington, they may even be thinking of Moscow, but let's not get sidetracked. The point is that in this case, the A shares grant special rights. First, the preferential obtaining of profits, as we've seen, but also the ability to have the majority of the board of directors, and therefore control over decisions. In this way, as we'll see in a moment, the Americans could block any actions or proposals made by the Ukrainians within the fund.
According to the draft agreement sent by the White House, the fund's executive board would be made up of 3 members appointed by the United States and 2 by Ukraine. This would give the Americans a majority, allowing them to do whatever they want with Ukraine's mineral, oil, gas resources, even its infrastructure, without the Ukrainians being able to do anything about it, since they'd have no real power within the fund to stop it.
But the point is that all the assets and rights that the fund would have would logically generate returns, interest, dividends, capital gains from asset sales, and so on. These profits could be used to invest in projects within Ukraine. The point is that, in this way, the United States would not only recover everything spent in Ukraine at a surcharge rate of 4% per year, but also that, from then on, even if the profits of the fund went to Ukraine, the United States would maintain control over this fund and, therefore, over all the assets it controlled, or in which it invested. Let me say it again. Washington would decide where and how to invest, and also what happens to all of the natural wealth of Ukraine. And not only that, the board of directors of the fund, controlled, remember, by the United States, is the one who has to decide whether or not to distribute profits to the Ukrainians or to a significant part of them. Put another way, if Kyiv has a disagreement with Washington, the Americans could decide to freeze the distribution of profits and thus cause a hole in the government's accounts. What do you think? Well, if this already seems crazy, there's still more. Much more. Well, in fact, we've only just begun, and I'm telling you that the key to this story is not in the profits, but above all, in the permanent control of its territory. In other words, to be clear, in the loss of sovereignty. The White House proposal also includes depriving Ukraine of jurisdiction over its own resources and over the fund. And what laws would apply then? Well, as you can probably guess, US law. Specifically, the fund would be registered in Delaware, applying the jurisdiction of both Delaware and New York. See for yourselves.
This agreement shall be governed by and construed in accordance with the laws of the state of Delaware.
Basically, with this, the United States could control the fund and decide on its activities, what it extracts from Ukraine and what it doesn't, and also control its infrastructure, without a single Ukrainian being able to prevent it, and all under American laws. But there's more. Washington would have preference in all projects. For instance, if a Ukrainian company wanted to exploit a rare earth deposit, and an American company also wanted to exploit it, the Ukrainian company would have no claim. The US company would keep it. And that's not all. The United States would also force the funds generated by the extraction of these resources to be converted directly into foreign currency and sent abroad. In other words, Washington would make sure to keep the generated funds in safe custody, even if this would mean a permanent hit to the Ukrainian currency. This would be another potential pressure measure against the Kyiv government to prevent them from taking autonomous decisions without Washington. The board may even decide to invest the fund's proceeds in US Treasury debt rather than in new projects in Ukraine. Put another way, we're basically looking at a license to plunder and extortion written in black and white. Practically a manual of economic neo-colonialism.
But Washington's power wouldn't even be limited to the Reconstruction Fund. The proposal also allows the United States to audit the books and accounts of any entity connected to this institution, to the fund, which, of course, would include a huge number of Ukrainian public bodies.
In other words, the sovereignty of the Ukrainian state itself is also being undermined and placed at the service of arbitrary inspections by the US government whenever they feel like it. Put another way, a colony. And take note, because the ignominy of this proposal does not even end there, although what we've already told you would be sufficiently insane. To top it off, the United States would also have the power to veto Ukrainian resource sales to other countries during the first year.
In other words, Ukraine would be banned from selling, say, rare earths to third parties if Washington didn't approve. And we're not just talking about countries like China, even Europe would be affected. And of course, this would also apply to any new investments related to Ukraine's natural resources, because for as long as the Reconstruction Fund is in place, the United States would enjoy what's known as a right of first offer.
For example, if a Canadian, Australian, or European mining company wants to invest in Ukraine, a US company would beat any of them to the punch by making an offer as well. In practice, this would mean that the United States could veto a lot of foreign investment in Ukraine for years. We've already told you that the contract seems to be out of Ukraine's budget. Now, I'm sure many of you are wondering where on earth Trump is going with this proposal. It's clear that the Ukrainians are going to reject it. In fact, they've already said that they are working on its modifications. But what is Trump hoping for with this kind of kick forward? Why has he suddenly modified the contract in this direction? Well, we're going to tell you next.
Share the spoils.
To begin with, let me ask you a question. With everything we've told you so far, do you think that the United States would finally provide Ukraine with security guarantees if it were to sign this proposal as is? Well, to those of you who think the answer is yes, I'm sorry to say you are wrong. After ceding all control of the country's mining and energy resources, its infrastructure, and granting them preferential market access, there wouldn't even be any security guarantees from Washington. Many of you might have thought that the very high price of accepting this proposal would at least go hand in hand with armoring Ukraine for the future, but no, nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, with the resources going to the United States until the full amount of aid plus 4% annual interest is repaid, the Ukrainian government would lose a significant source of revenue, which would, for example, limit its ability to maintain a military force large enough to deter Putin. Pay attention to this. But then, what on earth is Trump looking for with this proposal? Well, everything points to several things. To begin with, to prevent Ukraine from joining the European Union, which, by the way, goes against what his government said a few weeks ago. But yes, it is. Obviously, by giving US companies preferential treatment in Ukraine, the agreement would go against the competition rules and the single market of the European Union, so Ukraine would not be able to join the EU club.
We have the Constitution of Ukraine, which clearly states who owns what. Furthermore, the Constitution makes it clear that our course is towards the European Union. Nothing that can threaten Ukraine's accession to the EU can be accepted.
So why would Trump knowingly do this? Let's see. Everything indicates that Trump's idea for the future of Ukraine corresponds with Moscow's two big demands for after the war. Two demands that, by the way, are the ones that Putin has often used to justify his invasion. First of all, there is keeping Ukraine out of NATO, something that has already been practically eliminated from the political debate. And secondly, this proposal would prevent Ukraine from being able to join the European Union by contravening its rules. And remember one thing, this is also a key point of the conflict. Remember that the 2014 Euromaidan revolution against the government of then Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych exploded precisely because it fueled Ukraine's rapprochement with the European Union. And after that, when the Yanukovych government was overthrown, that's when the invasion of Crimea and part of the Donbass came in 2014. And the second installment came with the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. In other words, the issue of Ukraine's entry into the European Union has often been overlooked, but it's one of the most important aspects to this whole story. Evidently, with the American proposal, this path would be suspended for years, at least until the Ukrainians pay this supposed war debt, and one day the Americans decide to dissolve the fund and return control over resources back to the Ukrainians. But this would be at the sole discretion of Washington, which would have a majority on the board of directors that would have to make that decision. Of course, this would be great news for Putin, but that's not even all. Take a look at this news item.
US-Ukraine mineral deal tied to efforts to revive Russian gas exports to Europe.
In parallel to this proposed mineral deal with Ukraine, Trump is reportedly negotiating with Russia on ways to revive large-scale gas exports from Siberia to Europe. According to what is being learned about this negotiation, Donald Trump wants companies and financial entities with similar interests to obtain important stakes in the Russian gas business to Europe. And this is precisely where the US proposal comes into play. Check it out.
Russia and US discuss restarting Nord Stream pipelines, Kremlin says.
It's understood that the United States and Russia are already talking about ways to restore the flow of gas through the Nord Stream pipeline, running from Russia to Germany via the Baltic, as we told you in our last video here on VisualPolitik. But the key point is that, apart from the Nord Stream, another of the routes for Russian gas to Europe was carried out precisely with pipelines crossing Ukraine.
The United States could control these pipelines both directly and indirectly. It would do so directly if the fund invested money in them, for example, to carry out repairs, or indirectly if it did not invest money, using its majority membership on the fund's board to withhold new investments, or bring contractual pressures to bear if Kiev does not agree.
I know it's crazy and it doesn't make any sense, as the US gas sector is doing big business exporting LNG to Europe. And it makes no sense for a US president to go against the interests of his own energy industry to favour another country like Russia. But this is the situation. The only explanation some analysts point to is that secretly Putin and Trump are negotiating to divide the spoils of invaded Ukraine. Washington retains control and tens of billions of dollars in profits from much of Ukraine's rare earths, minerals, gas, and oil through the famous Reconstruction Plan, and Putin is favored with US help to export cheap piped gas to Europe again, while ensuring that Ukraine does not join the European Union. It sounds surreal, I know, but right now it's not being ruled out as something that could be happening. But VisualPolitik community, there's still another benefit for Trump in modifying this agreement: buying time and gaining a bargaining chip to cover his own back. I mean, Ukraine will most likely soon present a counter-proposal to this agreement, in which all, or almost all, of the craziest points we've told you about in this video will disappear. And then a tough negotiation between Trump and Zelensky will start again, with possible threats to cut off their arms and intelligence supplies, and it will be back to square one. It's like a circle that goes around and around to the starting point. Meanwhile, Putin continues to relentlessly attack Ukraine without making a single concession on the battlefront, and asking for absurd things like this.
Putin suggests UN administration of Ukraine. Russia's president has floated the idea of a UN-sponsored administration, leading Ukraine into elections before peace negotiations. The US said Ukrainians determine governance.
A UN government in Ukraine to hold elections before peace? Come on, Vladimir, we already know that you have no interest in stopping the war, but you could at least pretend a little. The thing is that this way, if Trump doesn't get the peace agreement, in the future, he can say that it's all Ukraine's and Europe's fault for refusing to sign this agreement on the country's natural resources. He would probably say something like this: "We gave them away for peace, but they didn't want it. They passed. They are very bad. They've robbed us. They didn't want to make deals with us. Let them work it out." And take note, because now Trumpism has that narrative trump card. If Ukraine does not sign an agreement, they cannot sign. If an agreement is ultimately reached, Washington will accept the changes proposed by Kyiv, and they will get their political mileage. Well, everything that we've told you now are things that will become clearer in the coming days or weeks, and you know that here on VisualPolitik, we will be here to tell you all about it. Until that happens, it's now your turn. Why do you think the Trump administration has presented a deal on these terms to Ukraine? Do you think the White House wants to prevent Ukraine from joining the European Union at all costs over the next few years? Who do you think is winning so far in all this negotiating? Leave us your comments below and let's start a debate. But first, if you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe to VisualPolitik if you haven't already done so. It's free and it helps us out a lot. Thank you so very much for being there. All the best. I'll see you next time.